Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Montgomery. I'm a historian of medicine and military history, but also, as I'm sure you can imagine, a cemetery historian, if you want to call it that. I love to explore old cemeteries. I've done it pretty much since I was a kid, but especially in the last probably 10 years, I've really taken my interest to the next level with photography, with book learning, and all kinds of other things. And yeah, I love to explore old cemeteries all over Ontario. And anytime I'm traveling anywhere, whether it's another country, region, whatever it is, I'm always looking for their old cemeteries. I believe they're great places to learn. And I'd like to tell you a little bit today about why Norfolk has some amazing cemeteries, sort of touch on a few little things. There is far too much to discuss in just one talk, but I think we can really scratch the surface nicely. And hopefully I'll be able to give other talks in the future. But in the meantime, I hope you learn some things. And I hope I inspire you to go out and, if you haven't already, to go and explore some of your old cemeteries. So I'm just going to put on my share screen here. Okay, so as the title of my talk indicates, it's exploring old Norfolk cemeteries. This picture here is from St. John's in Woodhouse, certainly one of my favorites in Norfolk. So I'd like to just start briefly with a question sometimes people ask: why explore old cemeteries? Well, there are many reasons, but one of the ones that I'd like to share with you, or several of the ones I should say, is the ones listed here. There are many more, but so first of all, the cemeteries are places of heritage and history. They quite literally contain the history of a community and the lives lived there and the stories that those people had and the sort of individual and the community all in one place. Number two, as you can see, story of individual lives, both common and great. We all pass away one day. It's a sad but necessary part of life, if you will. It's an inevitable thing for all of us. And so in the old cemeteries, you'll find both the common folk, if you will, and the great, quote unquote, great people who, you know, the wealthy, the prominent, the politicians, the people that had a large effect on their communities or nations or even internationally. They can almost always all be found in one cemetery. So this is another reason that cemeteries contain the whole history of the community. Number three, one of my personal favorites, is that old cemeteries have interesting symbols and what I like to call a lost language. A lot of the symbols and motifs on old gravestones, unless you're somebody who really has explored old cemeteries and has a strong understanding of Judeo-Christian symbols and history, it's sort of a lost language that a lot of people sort of can't read, so to speak. And learning about old cemeteries over time, you get to learn this language and you get to really understand the expressions, the meanings that these gravestones had, often multiple meanings and expressions. Number four, gravestones are a form of art. And old cemeteries, to me, and I'm not the first person that said this by any means, but they're like outdoor art museums. Gravestones were originally handcrafted, hand carved, and then eventually done in a factory style. But even the mass-produced gravestones of the 19th century, particularly the marble stones, have a character, they have a beauty to them, they have an art to them that really, if you stop and appreciate them, you can really understand just how much they meant to people and just how beautiful they are to look at. And there are, of course, many more reasons to visit old cemeteries. Genealogy, of course, is a big one these days, and many other reasons that I can't get into today. But these are just some of the reasons that I like to explore them, and I think sort of helps answer the question of why. So let's get started. So I wanted to start a little bit by talking about epitaphs on some of old Norfolk gravestones. So epitaphs, of course, were important. At the bottom of many gravestones, they expressed a meaning, either chosen by the deceased or usually by their family and sometimes by friends. And they often have a strongly Christian theme to them, given that people were quite religious. And so they often would be a way that people would express sadness, hope, all kinds of different emotions. So this first stone is for Alonzo Silverthorne. This is at Bookton Cemetery. Alonzo was a young boy. He died just in March 19th, 1846, at just 3 years old. So his epitaph reflects the way Christians in the 19th century attempted to rationalize and deal with the death of children, which sadly came often to many families from diseases such as diphtheria, scarlet fever, typhoid fever, tuberculosis, many more, sadly. So Alonzo Stone, the epitaph reads, "Weep not for me, my parents dear. I am not dead, but sleeping here. I was not yours, but God's alone. He loved me best and called me home." So here you can see this Christian idea of hope, even amidst deep sadness and sorrow and grief of the parents. And then here next door to him, so to speak, also at Bookton Cemetery, we have his brother, Stuart, who died the very next year in August of 1847. He was just 2 years and 4 months old. His stone reads, this is a much sadder one. So in contrast to the other theme of the one we just discussed in Alonzo's stone, it says, "Beneath this stone in sweet repose is laid a mother's dearest pride, a flower that scarce had waked to life and beauty ere it died." So here you can see the sort of opposite, the contrasting, the sad, the grief expressed here, which many epitaphs also express. Also at Bookton Cemetery here, we have one for Rebeccalena House, and she was a young girl. She, sorry, I'm just checking my notes here. She was just 1, and she passed away from cholera infantum, which was often in those days fatal form of gastroenteritis that occurred in infants. Not of the same cause as cholera, but having somewhat similar characteristics. So she passed away in 1891. She was just 1 year old, and her epitaph reads, "We loved this little tender one and would have wished her stay, but let our Father's will be done. She shines in endless day." And at the top of the stone, you can see it starts with "Our darling Beccalena." So another quite sad one, but again, here you can see that this is the expressing the idea of faith, you know, death and these sort of tough moments in life as a test of faith. And hence why they still make the point to say, you know, our Father, as in God, our Father's will be done. So another sad one, but again, expresses a strongly Christian motif and understanding. So this next slide, I just wanted to look at, you know, I'm going to be mixing in symbols and epitaphs in here because it's sort of difficult to completely separate them, but I wanted to start discussing a little bit some of the symbols you'll see. One of the popular ones in the 19th century on gravestones was a finger pointing upward to heaven. It's a little difficult to see here, but you can see there's the hand and there's a finger pointing up. The finger's kind of a little bit bent one way, but finger pointing upwards to heaven. This is for a little girl, or I think a woman. No, sorry, little girl. And her name was just Rose. All it says is Rosella Lynn has gone home. So she was just 6 months. So obviously, I don't think I need to explain this symbol too much, but it essentially expresses the faith of the deceased and their family that the person has, quote unquote, gone home. And I'm sorry for my typo. It says gas gone home. It should say has gone home. Always one typo slips through. Some gravestones, these are some of the particularly interesting ones I find. Some of them, if you're lucky, so to speak, or you know, you come across some sort of what I would call hidden gems of old gravestones. And this is something we don't really see on gravestones today, that some old gravestones actually expressed the actual way the person died. So, you know, in the case of, in Ontario, there were standardized death records after 1869. Provincially, and before that they were haphazard and, you know, done by churches and where there wasn't really a centralized way of doing it, so a lot of those records were lost. So pre-1869, unless you find something about the person's death in a newspaper, it can be very hard to actually figure out how that person passed away. Sometimes they didn't even list it even in the death notice or obituary in the newspaper. So this is where old gravestones can actually come in handy genealogists or historians in general for finding out how somebody passed away. So this one is at St. John's Anglican Cemetery in Woodhouse, and it's for Dr. William Thomas Salmon, who was a local physician. And his stone says on it, he was a member of the Royal College of Surgeons, London, England. And then it says, he fell a victim to malignant scarlet fever contracted in the exercise of his profession. He passed away February 3rd, 1864. So this stone expresses several things. One of them, of course, was the pride at belonging to the Royal College of Surgeons, England, which was a very prestigious organization. Probably at that time, I would say the most prestigious in the world to belong to. And so, of course, being in Canada, it would have been quite proud to, as a member of the colony, he would have been quite proud to be a member of that organization. And then in addition, it expresses this sort of heroic belief or this heroic understanding of doctors as being on the front line of disease, which as they are today, they were then. And so it's sort of talking about, how he contracted it. And sorry, I made a mistake earlier. I meant to say he contracted it, I think in February, and then passed away later that month. I'm not 100% sure because the stone is underneath the ground, but essentially we can now see here just by reading this stone how it was that this physician passed away. So important for historians, and especially in this case, if you're interested in the history of medicine and sort of the dangers that doctors encountered when they were having to deal with patients at a time when there wasn't really the same kind of understanding we have today about, the kind of things we see today about wearing masks and different types of preventative measures. This next stone is a sad stone. A lot of them are, of course, but this is at Woodhouse United Church Cemetery down the road from St. John's. And this is for a woman named Rachel Hazen, or Hazen. I think it's pronounced Hazen. I'm not sure. But so Rachel was living with her aunt and uncle, and they were farmers. Her aunt and uncle were farmers. And sadly, there wasn't a specific way that it was described on the death record or stone as to how it occurred. But if it's hard to see from that picture, but it says Rachel Hazen, niece of Edwin Gilbert. And then up close on the epitaph towards the ground, it says her death was caused by her clothes taking fire the day before her decease. And she died, as you can see, May 4th, 1876. So it's a very sad stone, but again, a stone that gives an indication as to how it was that she passed away. And she was just 28 years old. So this gives you an indication. Oftentimes, sadly, for women in that era, dying in their 20s, often caused by pregnancy complications and or the actual postpartum issues. So in this case, it indicates that she died not of that, but of something else, and quite a sad, tragic death. I'm purely speculating here, but I would imagine something to do with maybe cooking or near an oil lamp or any number of things that could happen to people in those days. But again, an example of how an old stone can sometimes tell you how it was that a person died. And in this case, because she passed away after 1869, I was able to look up the death record, and the death record confirms the information on the stone. It just says burned, and that's it, sadly. On the top of the stone, we have a symbol here, a lily. And lilies often symbolized in the 19th century purity, innocence, and they also had the meaning oftentimes of resurrection because of Easter lilies and Jesus, Easter, etc. So this stone's unfortunately a little hard to read because the lettering wasn't etched too deeply, and it's sort of hard to catch it in a way that is easy in photography to spot. But this is also at St. John's Cemetery in Norfolk County. Well, Norfolk, sorry, I should say Woodhouse. Of course, it's in Norfolk. So this is a granite pointed arch stone. So pointed arch is also known as a Gothic arch, which were quite popular. The Gothic was quite popular in cemeteries, Gothic designs and symbols. So you'll see that a lot in old cemeteries. This is for a gentleman named Andrew Lees. He was a barrister or lawyer, if you will. He passed away in October 1875, he was just 25 and he passed away from typhoid fever. And here's an example. This stone, I should say, is an example of how the epitaphs and this information can indicate things like who actually had the stone put up for the person. So in this case, you can't see it from the photo, but it actually says the stone was erected by his mother. It says erected by his mother. And then at the base, it says, we all do fade as a leaf. And this is from the Bible. This is the book of Isaiah 64, chapter 64, verse 6. And you see quite a few of these epitaphs of this type of theme on stones for people who died young. And the idea, of course, is often it was to contrast nature, flowers, or in this case, a leaf, as the life of those things being fleeting, just like human lives were considered very fleeting in those days when people could pass away quite young, and it happened quite often. So you'll see these kind of epitaphs often to sort of as a reminder to the deceased about how nothing lasts forever, and people's lives are short in the grand scheme of things. So I want to look now at more symbols and statues and stories. So this stone, which some of you might have recognized from the advertisement that Kathy did for this talk. This is at Greenwood Cemetery in Waterford, and this is if you're entering from the east entrance. You come up the road and you see it pretty close in the distance when you arrive in the center of the cemetery. And this is atop a large monument for the Sovereign family, who have many family members buried in Greenwood. So you see a figure, a woman dressed in classical clothing, and she has a diadem with a star on her head, and unfortunately piece is broken, but her left hand and arm are leaning on an anchor. And this is the allegorical figure of hope. So anytime you see a statue in an old cemetery holding an anchor, that is hope. And the meaning of the anchor, which can be found, it can be found as a standalone motif on old gravestones. You'll just see an anchor and that's it on the top of a regular gravestone, or near the top, I should say. Now, this one sometimes confuses people, and you sometimes still see misinformation on the internet about the anchor symbolizing that the person the deceased might have been a sailor, but it actually is a reference to hope. And this comes from the Bible. It's Paul's letter to the Hebrews, chapter 6, verse 19. And I'll just read to you. I have the quotation. I don't have it all memorized. So it says, which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, and which entereth into that within the veil. So in the chapter, St. Paul's discussing God's promise to the faithful. And so this is part of that chapter. And so this passage was considered of great comfort, and you'll see hope and the idea, the motif, the anchor on a lot of stones. And this was of great comfort to people in the 19th century, particularly when confronting death, because it essentially assured people that Jesus had entered beyond the veil of death, and that their hope in God was, again, quote, sure and steadfast. So when you see an anchor on old gravestones, or in this case with a statue, the statue always means hope. In the case of the gravestones, the regular tablet gravestones, or some of the other styles, in very few cases does the anchor mean that the person was a sailor. That doesn't mean that it doesn't happen occasionally. There certainly are instances of that, especially if you're looking at a naval veteran's gravestone, for example. But in most cases, it means hope, and that's what the motif being expressed is. This next photo, one of my favorite Norfolk cemeteries, this is from Evergreen Cemetery in Lyndoch. And this is a monument for J. Paul Charlton, who was a son of the politician and lumber merchant William Andrew Charlton. And so the son, J. Paul Charlton, whom the monument is for, passed away in 1894. He was just 17 years old. I've never been able to find a cause because I couldn't find one on the death record. And the newspaper article I did find also didn't mention the cause, but we can imagine any number of things from those days. So the epitaph on this stone at the bottom says, "And they shall bring the glory and honor of the nations into it." And that's referring to the New Jerusalem. Um, and then above it, here you have what's called a recording angel. So if you look, you can see, obviously you can see the angel, no problem, but the angel's actually holding a quill pen in its hand here and holding a book. So the book here is considered to be the Lamb's Book of Life. This is from the New Testament. And so here you have an example where the epitaph and the the statue above it actually correspond to each other. So the idea being expressed here is that the deceased is going to be or is already written into the Lamb's Book of Life, meaning that they're assured eternal life. So that's quite a beautiful one. And here you can see a close up. So there you can see a little better that it's holding this quill pen. And it's quite a beautiful statue. Evergreen has several beautiful statues in it. So I encourage anyone. It's also beautiful sitting right off of the valley there. So it's quite a nice, tranquil place to visit. Sorry, just one moment. I'm just going to have a sip of my drink. So returning to the idea I mentioned earlier of gravestones as art. So this is one of my favorite examples. This is from Hillcrest Cemetery in Forestville. So this stone is a true work of art. It's for a woman named Anne Amelia Arnold Ward. Anne died at just 23 in 1852. Again, I haven't been able to find a cause anywhere. But again, could be any number of things. So on her stone, there's a male mourner who's sitting on a tombstone, and beside him is a little girl, likely his daughter, and he's holding a book in his right hand. And then behind them are three weeping willow trees. And I don't think I really need to say too much about the idea being expressed here. Obviously, mourning, I think that sort of is obvious from the sort of self-explanatory. But this is a stone by Samuel Gardner, who was a Norfolk carver. And the Norfolk Museum team has done some videos on and one on Gardner that describes his life. So I encourage you all to watch that video. It's very neat. They did a great job with it. So Gardner was, I won't belabor it since they've done a video on it, but suffice it to say, Gardner was a true artist, a master carver, and an artist with his stones. His stones are head and tails, in my opinion, more beautifully carved than almost any other stones in the cemeteries, in every cemetery I've seen them in. So when you look at his stones, they often express many things, and they're quite beautiful in their detail. So here in this close-up, we can see better some of this. So here are the weeping willows. Here's the little girl standing beside the man. The man is leaned over in grief, holding a book, likely the Bible. Often the idea was they were searching the scriptures or going to the scriptures for consolation during these kinds of times. But it's amazing the detail you can see on this stone. You can even see here the little ruffles in his sleeves. You can see some ruffles in his pant leg. You can see his boots. It's or shoes, I think. Just an incredible level of detail. And if you get up really close to the stone in person, you can even see little details of the faces, which is just quite incredible. And then it has this beautiful design here with what's called an ogee arch in the middle. So just a really, really beautiful stone. And something, again, that is a true work of art to look at, obviously expressing quite a sorrowful theme, but nonetheless beautiful. This is also in Hillcrest, which I believe is also a Gardner stone. And again, another example of a male mourner on a statue. And I should point out, if I haven't already, that male mourners are quite rare on gravestones. They tended in the 19th century to portray women in mourning, leaning over stones or things of that nature. But in this case, we actually have a few examples of male mourners, which are quite rare. Again, something that makes exploring some of the Norfolk cemeteries neat and kind of unique in a way. So this stone is for Elizabeth Fairchild. She was born in 1784 and died in 1855. Again, I haven't been able to find a cause, but I imagine in those days it's probably old age or something related to that. So again, you can see all kinds of details on this stone here. So I'll just get to the close up here. So this one was a little dirty the day I visited, but again, you can see weeping willows behind him. You can see the outline. It's unfortunately the stone has eroded due to weather, etc. But here you can see the outline of the stone, and you can see that his one elbow is leaning down, and then his other hand is leaning on it. And again, you can see details of his it looks like boots in this case, and his coat. And then it looks like he's holding a handkerchief, likely a handkerchief. And so again, I don't really have to say too much about this. I actually had a friend and somebody I think online when I posted this stone pointed out that they thought it looked like another hand coming out here. And then this was a face, possibly meaning that this was supposed to represent Elizabeth reaching out from beyond the grave to console her husband. I personally can't see that myself. I think he's leaning on a stone because you can see his elbow here. And I think maybe it looks like it might be that. I actually think it's probably what's called a pedestaled urn, which is you'd have the gravestone here, and then you'd have the urn on top here, and he's leaning on that. So that's what I think. But perhaps one day, if it's cleaned, somebody will be able to have a look. But I encourage anyone who's interested to go have a look themselves and see what they see from it. And maybe you can correct me. Maybe that is a hand reaching out. I don't think so, but I'm happy to be corrected if that's the right answer. So going back to symbols again. So we're at Evergreen Cemetery again in Lyndoch. So this was a popular motif, not hugely common, but certainly one of the ones you'll see more often. And so this is obviously a beautiful white marble stone. And this is for a woman whose name was Selina Flood. She passed away in July 1873. She was 53. She died of an ovarian tumor. And her stone has a hand you can see reaching down and plucking a broken chain. And the epitaph reads, "Kind friends, beware as you pass by. As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Prepare therefore to follow me." So this is a variation of an epitaph in the style of what's called a memento mori, which is Latin for remember that you must die, which sounds very grim by today's standards. But in the context of the 19th century and earlier, when these were put on gravestones, the idea was to remind the reader about how fleeting life is, and about how death can come at any time. And certainly in those days, death could come at any time. So this was a message that would have resonated a lot with people in those days when they saw death more often and more people passing away at what would today's standards be a very young age. So in terms of the symbol, I'm going to go to the close up here. So now in terms of the symbol, so you can see the hand reaching down, and there's the chain coming up. And so the symbolism overall is death, but the hand coming down on old gravestones is meant to represent the hand of God coming down from heaven. So in this case, in the case of this motif, the idea is that, death has come, God is breaking the chain, so to speak. And in the case of Selina, I was able to look up her death record, and the death record indicated, if it was accurate, it says that she passed away 3 months after her illness began, which even in those days standards would have been quite a fast progression. Likely she had symptoms before that, but people then didn't have the kind of tools to examine. So she might have been sick before and passed it off as any number of things, and then realized she was seriously sick later on. The 3 months is still quite a quick time to pass away after the onset. So the hand with the broken chain is specifically often used for deaths for young people or for people who died suddenly. This is not always the case with most gravestone symbols and motifs. There are always exceptions to the rule, so it's very tough to make generalizations that are true in all cases. I have seen instances where the hand plucking the chain does not indicate somebody that died young or suddenly, but in most instances, in my experiences, it has. So this is just one example. So I want to show you more examples of this motif so you can see the pattern as I'm discussing, so you know that I'm not just imagining it. So this is from Delhi Cemetery. This is for a woman named Maggie Parle. And Maggie passed away. She was just 19, and she passed away in January 1881 from puerperal convulsions related to pregnancy. So again, I mentioned a few minutes ago about the dangers of childbirth and pregnancy. And so this is an example of it here. She was just 19. Obviously, pregnancy very dangerous for 19th century women, especially at a time when they often were expected to have many children. So certainly one of the most common ways that young women passed away in those days. So again, you can see here, I don't have a close-up for this one, but you can see again the hand coming down, and then in this case the fingers actually is inside one of the little chain links, and then here you can see that the chain is broken. So again, an example of this motif expressing a young death, a sudden death in her case, in both young and sudden. Here's yet another example. This is the third example. I'm not going to give you too many, but here's the third. And this is also from St. John's in Woodhouse. And this is for a man named William Campbell. William was a farmer, and he passed away at just 31 from cholera morbus. 31 or 33. There is a bit of a discrepancy between the death record and the stone. Stone says 33, death record says 31. But he passed away from what's called cholera morbus, which was a 19th century term for what we now would call gastroenteritis, which is an illness that causes cramps, diarrhea, and in severe cases, vomiting. So it's different from cholera proper, which was also common in earlier days, but different kind of disease. So again, here you can see the hand pulling up the chain. There you can see the finger inside the chain link. I don't recall if the chain was actually broken, but you can see it looks like it is breaking because the two links here are close together and this one is separated. So I believe that it's indicating that it's breaking here. So again, this is this idea that that was expressed through this motif of a young death, sudden death. So just going to a few stories, we've talked about some symbols and kind of touched on a little bit about people's occupations, or a slight bit of information about their backgrounds. But I wanted to just talk briefly just about a few stories, because again, gravestones tell stories, and in some cases you can actually glean some specifics about the person and or their death, meaning the event itself, what caused the death to occur. So this stone is at Oakwood Cemetery in Simcoe, and it's for a man whose full name was John Jones Boyd. He obviously went by Jones, since his gravestone just says Jones Boyd, and it says in memoriam above it in Latin in that beautiful carving, so in memory of Jones Boyd. And he was his death record indicates he was an assistant railway agent, and he passed away on August 16th, 1878. Sadly, he was crushed by a train car at the Port Dover rail station. And in this case, the death record actually contains some of the information. And then I was also able to look in the Norfolk Reformer newspaper, and very, very tragic sort of description of the death, but it says that he actually died in his mother's arms. So very, very sad story. If the newspaperman wrote it accurately, without embellishing the tale, so to speak, it's possible that he was hurt but still alive, and then his mother might have been informed and come in, and he passed away in her arms. Either way, it's very tragic and sad, and particularly if the details are true. But it shows you here again, from a historical standpoint, how you can use a gravestone to find out a name, and then from that name use the date of death, and then start doing some searching. Look at the death record, look at newspapers, to figure out exactly how it was that somebody passed away. So again, it was sad. Jones was just 25. His stone, just because I like to nerd out about these things, his stone is actually, you can see as a scroll here. So you can see the top of the scroll, and then here it's unfurling, And actually, it's got some sort of folds in it, which is really quite nice. This stone is another example of some interesting stories you can come across. Being somebody who's not from Norfolk County, I particularly like to learn these stories because I'm not an expert in Norfolk county history. I know some things more than the average person, I would hope. But I'm certainly not an expert like the people at the museum say would be. So for me, learning these stories is quite a nice little entryway into some of the history of your county. And so this is a really interesting stone. This is for Thomas Butler and his wife. His wife's name is, her birth name was Auckland, so Mary Auckland Butler. And so I came across this stone. I thought the design was interesting. And so I took my photo and went back a few weeks later and was looking at the photos I took that day, looked up the death record. And I figured out that his occupation said jailer on it. So I thought that was quite interesting. It's certainly not a profession that you come across often on old death records. So I decided to look just a little bit into who they were. And so in this case, Thomas was actually was the governor of the county jail in Norfolk until he died in 1906. And Mary was his assistant. So I found an obituary from the newspaper that said, and it's quite a long one, but I want to read it to you because I thought it was a good example of how gravestones start the research, and then you can buttress that research with other information, sometimes from other sources. So here we have, so it says, "It is with deep regret that we record the death of Mr. Thomas W. Butler, who for some months has been suffering from a protracted illness which terminated on Saturday evening last. Mr. Butler, for a period of 28 years, was the governor of the Norfolk County Jail and filled that position at the time of his death. During the whole tenure of his office, he performed the duties of the position in a most efficient manner, was painstaking, careful, and courteous. To all whom he came in contact in the execution of his duties as jailer, was it a noticeable fact that while always courteous and polite, he never swerved from the strict performance of the duties of the responsible position he held. He was a man of sterling character and excellent qualifications, and a unique fact in this connection is that during all the period he was jailer, never once did a grand jury of this county make a report or presentment, but that the same referred in the highest terms to the excellent order and cleanliness in which the jail was always found." Now, I can't confirm any of those details. I don't know. Sometimes newspapers had a way of embellishing, but it's quite an interesting one because it gives you nonetheless a lot of background about his life. And interesting in this case, at a time when women were often only thought of in relation to their husbands, it's interesting because Mary actually got a section of this obituary as well. And it says here, "There survive him his wife, Mary Butler, who for a like period with her husband has been patron of the jail, and who will now leave that institution with the knowledge and satisfaction that she has been a valuable assistant and has served the county well during her long term of service." And then the article ends by noting that the county council came to Thomas's funeral, as well as the Masonic Lodge and the Ancient Order of Foresters. So this was obviously a testament to the fact that he was respected in the community and held an important position. So, this is just one good example of how cemetery stones can lead you into a story about people's lives, and in this case, connected directly to county history, with him being the jailer, and obviously jails being important institutions throughout any period since their existence. So I don't have too many more. I don't want to overload you with information or talk too long. So I wanted to wind down the presentation with some more common symbols seen in Norfolk cemeteries. Often I find when I was talking with Kathy about what kind of things to discuss in this talk, I said to her, it's sometimes hard to choose because there are so many things you could talk about, and I have thousands upon thousands of photos from all over that I could show. So narrowing it down is very difficult, but I often find that people are most interested in the symbols and motifs on old gravestones because of the sort of what I called the lost language earlier, that they speak to people. So I wanted to wind down with a few of those, just perhaps so that if you are now exploring old cemeteries, you might have learned a few things and you can apply that knowledge to walking some of them yourself and learning from those themes and hopefully get interested in the people's lives. So one of the common ones here, this is from Greenwood and Waterford again. So this is the symbol called the clasp hands. Some people call it shaking hands, but essentially the hands holding one another are clasped hands. So this motif can actually mean several things. It's not just as straightforward as it appears. It can depend on other things, what it means. It doesn't always just mean shaking hands. But in this case, or I should say in some cases, and this one being one of them, you can infer from both the hands and the way they look and the epitaph or the writing above that will give you these. This can sometimes give you a hint as to what the hands are meant to evoke in the specific context of the individual stone. So in this case, this is for a woman named Elizabeth Slot. I hope I'm pronouncing the name right. Slaght. I think it's pronounced Slot. It sounds like it's a German background, perhaps, or Dutch. But so this stone for Elizabeth Slot, she passed away in 1885. She was 85 years old. So the clasped hands here actually have above them the words, "Meet me in the land above." So in the land above, obviously meaning heaven. So here you can infer from that the hands here are sort of either a symbolic parting, sort of a last holding of handshake or holding of hands before separation at death. Or it could also mean that it's a symbolic reunion in heaven, the hands meeting once again in heaven. So it's difficult to tell for sure, but I think it's certainly one of those two. And either way, it's you can infer that the hands are meant to evoke something, not just there as a decorative thing. So this is another one from Greenwood, and also the hands holding or clasped hands. So here, and I'm gonna bring you the close up so we can get a better view of it. But here you have the hands, and then you have this one's quite nice. It's some of the more artistically carved stones with the hands will actually have details. So here you can see folds in the sleeve cuff. Here you can actually see a button. So this one actually indicates that the female, the style of dress, so the female hand is actually, the woman's hand is on the left and the man's with the button and the sleeve here is on the right. So so here you can actually see they're trying to show you that one is husband, one is wife. And then above it actually has the word farewell here with a little, so it's a little ribbon and says farewell. So in this case, we can infer that the hands are meant to evoke a symbolic parting on earth to meet again in heaven. So farewell for, it should say farewell in bracket for now, because the idea that most Christian gravestones express is that life on earth is just the beginning, and then you go to eternal life in heaven. So farewell. So the last three stones I wanted to look at briefly are also Gardner stones again. Again, his stones are incredibly beautiful, and they are just so nicely carved. You can see all the beautiful lettering here, different types of fonts, and just these big bold letters that are really easy to read even all this time later. So so in this case, you have a stone for a woman named Phoebe Mar. And she passed away. She was just 21. Again, I wasn't able to find a cause. But her stone has a very common symbol that you'll see, or motif on gravestones, and both on the smaller stones and the large obelisks and things that will, or columns that will sometimes have an urn on top. So this is an urn here. And then this is actually meant to be, it's drapery. It's actually meant to be a veil or a pall. And so you can see that this is half covering the urn. So this is a classical symbol. something from ancient Greece and Rome, and where sometimes people were cremated and then put in an urn, where the remains were put in an urn. So a lot of people get confused by this because they think, well, nobody was getting cremated in the 19th century in Canada, so why would it be, or at least not on a large scale and not officially. So a lot of people ask the question, well, why would they have urns on their gravestones? And this was because the study of classics was quite popular in the 18th century, 19th century, especially in the 19th century in Canada and early 20th even. So oftentimes Christians drew on these symbols, even though they were considered quote unquote pagan, as a way to express they use these symbols to express things in their own time. So the urn obviously can symbolize death, and then in this case you have the drapery over it, so which can symbolize both mourning, and then also it's been interpreted as meaning sort of a veil between life and death. So this idea that the urn being half covered and the veil over it, it's been symbolizes mourning and sort of this idea of, well, they've entered into the veil. So there can be several meanings. And as with today, there wasn't always a 100% agreement between people on what the symbols meant. So there were general understandings, but so it could be used for different purposes, but those were the most common ones. And then, urns were quite a ubiquitous symbol in old cemeteries, in 19th century cemeteries. So this was at Woodhouse United Church Cemetery again. And if you pass through that cemetery and many others across Ontario and beyond, you'll see urns everywhere. And just in the background of this photo, you can see an urn up here on this stone behind it. So quite a ubiquitous symbol. So that's some of the meanings of it. But if you're interested, you can, there's quite a bit of information on the internet about that. This is another beautiful Gardner stone here. This one, I love Gardner stones because they express sometimes several ideas or meanings in them, or on them, I should say. So this one's quite beautiful for a woman named Jane Matthews. She passed away in 1855. It looks like, I think she was 55. I don't have it written down. I think it was 50. It looks like 55. But again, beautiful carving, beautiful fonts. You look at how amazing he did this W with that flourish on both sides of the letter, just incredible. And what makes this really beautiful is the meanings it expresses. So here you have a bird, which is a dove. So you have a dove descending from heaven, and it's carrying an olive sprig in its mouth. And then you have 4 books in the picture. So the dove, I think a lot of people are even if you're not familiar with old cemeteries, you're familiar with the dove as a symbol of peace. And in the Christian context, both peace and the symbol of the Holy Spirit. So the olive sprig in the mouth comes from the book of Genesis, and the idea and the story of Noah's Ark, when the dove returns with the olive sprig, indicating that the floodwaters had receded and that God had made peace with humanity. So this idea, this motif, was applied sometimes to gravestones with the dove with the olive sprig in its mouth, indicating that the deceased is at peace and is at peace with God, and then obviously being visited by the Holy Spirit. I should point out that also sometimes the olive sprig was not in the dove's mouth. Sometimes it's just the dove, but either way, the expression, the meaning is similar. And in this case, you're left to infer with the 4 books. You think to yourself, 4 books, what would that mean? Well, my guess would be the 4 books would be the 4 gospels by the 4 evangelists, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John of the New Testament. That would be my guess. I can't say for sure. If anybody has other ideas, I'm open to hearing them, but that would be my guess. And lastly, this is another stone from St. John's in Woodhouse. And again, like you're seeing this similar. This is another Gardner stone, and you're seeing the dove again. But this one's interesting because it has a few extra symbols that the other one doesn't have. So you have the dove coming down, you have the olive sprig, you have two books in this case. So again, we'd have to guess, but I would say maybe possibly Old Testament and New Testament. I'm not sure. But either way, clearly meant to be religious books, I would imagine. And then you have behind it a trumpet coming out. It looks like it's coming out from the book, or it's at least beside and behind the book. And then you have an hourglass here. so it's interesting because you look at these and you think of the meanings they have, and again you can look to biblical passages as a way to understand what some of it means. So the hourglass is a pretty obvious one, symbol of time and symbol of the fleeting nature of time, and sort of the fact that human life is not eternal, or at least on earth not eternal in the Christian context. But again, you have the trumpet. So here you can look to the Bible, and you have a few mentions of the trumpet in the Bible, but the one I think would apply, or certainly could be applied here, would be St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, his first letter to the Corinthians. And he says, and I'm quoting here, I have it beside me, "Behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of an eye, at the last trump. For the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall be changed. For this corruptible must put on incorruption, and this mortal must put on immortality." It's quite a powerful chapter. And so there's certainly that. And then there's also the mention of the trumpets in the book of Revelation. So certainly, you have an understanding that either way, the meaning is something to do with the deceased being resurrected at some point in the future. It's when the trumpet sounds. So again, here you have kind of this mixture of mortality and immortality symbols. So quite a beautiful one. Thank you very much for watching. Again, I wasn't sure how long to make the talk, but I didn't want to make it too long. So I hope you feel like you've learned some things. I wanted to thank Norfolk County and Kathy for organizing the talk, and Melissa Culver I've had many discussions with over the last year. So thank you to everyone. So I hope you learned some things. I hope you found it fascinating. And I encourage all of you to get out and explore your old cemeteries if you don't already. Norfolk, in my opinion, has some of the best cemeteries in Ontario. Certainly some of the best preserved, and lots of unique and interesting stones, lots of beautiful stones that have survived the test of time because they've been well cared for by people. That's something never to forget, that even as durable as stone is, without care and maintenance by oftentimes volunteers, sometimes paid staff, but often volunteers, without that care, these stones would disappear quite quickly. They are subject to weather, they're subject to nature, trees falling, tree limbs falling on them if the tree isn't cut back properly, vandalism, all kinds of things. So it always is important to express appreciation for the people that care for these places and keep them beautiful. So, although death is a subject that many of us are not comfortable with, a lot of people are very uncomfortable with this subject, and we try to avoid it. You can learn a lot about past people, about spirituality, religion, and many more topics from exploring old cemeteries, just from looking at an old gravestone and asking the question, what happened to this person and what was their life like? You can learn about the context of their lives, and certainly I've learned a lot about the 19th century, about occupations I didn't even know existed, that don't exist anymore, about the social lives of people. Oftentimes I'm looking at censuses to look at, if I can find them, about, how many people did this person live with and where did they come from, etc. And so you end up learning quite a bit about the context of the time in which these people lived. So I think old cemeteries can be great research tools, and in addition to that, places to just go for a tranquil walk. I look at cemeteries. My wife and I often go for walks in old cemeteries instead of parks, because they are like parks in a lot of ways, but you also have artwork and history, sort of the story of a community there. And they're often not as well traveled or not as heavily traveled as a park. So you get to enjoy the space often to yourself. And if you're respectful and you respect the fact that they are also places of mourning for if the cemetery has a new section where relatives are still visiting the stone frequently, if you respect that and sort of, I stick to the old section, so that way I'm never encroaching on people's space when they want to visit deceased loved ones. But if you can approach them with respect and appreciate them, they can be quite beautiful, tranquil places for to think and to yeah, just to contemplate life and to get away from the stressful, hectic daily life and weekly life things. So if anyone has any questions or you wish to contact me, here is my email information. And since the talk is being recorded, I know that you'll be able to pause it and go back if you can't find all of these things here. So on that note, thank you very much again to Norfolk County and the staff who organized the talk. And thank you very much for watching this talk. I hope you learned some things, and I'm always open for feedback. If there in the future, if there is more you'd like to hear of, less of, whatever it is, I'm always open to constructive ideas about how to make the presentations as interesting as possible. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see or speak with some of you at some point in the future. Bye.